Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to get settled, and then we'll get started. Hello, everyone. I think everyone's more or less settled. Welcome to Ask the Expert. My name is John L. Lagabon. I'm a business development executive here at Burdock Group, and we'll be moderating today's discussion. Before I introduce today's expert, I want to give a brief background on us and provide a couple notes about this event. As many of you know, Burdock Group is an ingredient safety and regulatory firm that has been helping food, dietary supplement, and feed ingredient innovators overcome regulatory obstacles to bring their ingredients to market. Over 30 years, we've helped clients with label reviews, claims guidance, safety assessments, study protocol review and management, risk assessments, as well as NDINs, FAPs, and of course, GRAS. This afternoon's event is a live Q&A where you will get the opportunity to receive answers to your unique questions. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted their questions. If any of you think of questions during the event, please submit it through the questions tab on the GoToWebinar sidebar, and we will do our best to provide an answer today. However, if we can't answer today, we'll follow up with an answer via email after the event. As always, if you want to speak with one of our experts, please don't hesitate to reach out at info@burdockgroup.com, and we will do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. Today's Burdock Group expert is no stranger to many of you. In fact, you may have seen him at a Society of Toxicology event, an Institute of Food Technology meeting, or listened to one of his many past talks. He earned a doctorate in toxicology from Medical College of Virginia within the Virginia Commonwealth University, and has over 15 years of experience advising clients regarding ingredient safety and regulatory affairs. A cornerstone to our company, I'd like to welcome Burdock Group's very own Director of Toxicology, Dr. Ray Matulka. Thank you for taking the time to answer some questions today, Ray.
Thank you, John L. I appreciate that introduction. It's very nice. I first want to give some general overviews of GRAS, which is an acronym for Generally Recognized as Safe. Keep in mind, this is a viable regulatory path for food ingredients to go into interstate commerce in the U.S. And I wanted to just point on some basic factors of the GRAS rule, GRAS status, and how you can move forward within the GRAS process. First and foremost, GRAS is basically a generation of two different parts of evaluation of a safety of a food ingredient. The first part is the scientific or historical data that's utilized to determine that something is safe. That has to be present in order to evaluate whether the ingredient can go into food. FDA typically wants to see that safety in data as the ingredient is consumed by the population or the intended use. So the intended use means when it's used as consumed. The second part is that the scientific or historical data that's used to substantiate the GRAS or help conclude a GRAS conclusion status must be generally recognized. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what does this generally recognized mean? And it's usually the fact that this data, the scientific data, has to be recognized by the scientific community, which FDA typically thinks of and infers to mean that the scientific data has to be published in peer-reviewed journals that toxicologists or other food safety experts would be reading and evaluating. So you have to really keep that idea that one, it's the safety data, which is required and has to be the same consistency and depth of knowledge as would be for something submitted directly to FDA under a food additive petition. But the second part is that it has to be generally recognized, i.e. published. So those are two major things that we have to think of when we're moving forward with the GRAS process. The other thing is that one method to show that this GRAS, this ingredient, this conclusion of GRAS safety is generally recognized is to convene a panel of experts. And those experts need to have training in evaluating the safety of ingredients. So that is when I've gotten many questions in the past saying, well, how do you determine who's an expert? Well, that is very much dependent on what their background is, what the ingredient is, in order to find the expert that would understand both the ingredient and how it's applied, as well as their background in scientific expertise. So also keep in mind that the GRAS status for an ingredient is not necessarily for the ingredient itself, but it's for the intended use of the ingredient. So you're not GRASing or determining GRAS of an ingredient, but how that ingredient is used, which many times connects with how much of that ingredient is consumed or expected to be consumed by the local consumer. So the other point that I wanted to bring up really quickly before we get into the question and answer part is concerning the ability to notify a GRAS ingredient. Now, everybody talks about, notifying FDA or FDA GRAS. Keep in mind that once you meet the conclusion of GRAS status and have that dossier and conclude that, typically through a panel of experts, you have met the threshold for moving that ingredient into interstate commerce. You've met the threshold that FDA has defined. So in that case, you do not need to notify that ingredient to the FDA. So that is a voluntary step. The only other thing that I wanted to bring up is the fact that GRAS is only one method in terms of evaluating and determining that a food ingredient is safe and meets the threshold of safety for FDA for interstate commerce. Now, because FDA is a federal entity and they have jurisdiction over interstate commerce, states generally have jurisdiction over interstate commerce. But for FDA or the federal level, most ingredients within the Code of Federal Regulations, as well as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, state that any ingredient going into food must be determined to be safe under a food additive if it has not already been determined to be generally recognized as safe. So you can have ingredients to be a food additive and go through the food additive petition process within the FDA, or you can go through the GRAS process. With that, I believe we can get started on the questions.
Fantastic. Thank you for the good overview. I think it really sets the scene. And to build on one of the last points you made, the asker of this first question that we're going to start with mentioned it was a very basic question, but I think it's a good place to start. The question is, what is the difference between GRAS and self-affirmed GRAS?
Good question. There's a lot of terms out there that a lot of people use. Self-affirmed GRAS, self-GRAS, FDA GRAS. Let me go through some of the points. FDA in their regulations does not make a distinction between self-GRAS versus self-affirmation. Those are the same things because, first and foremost, GRAS or a conclusion of GRAS status is made by a company or made by a person or panel of experts. There, long ago, FDA used to affirm the GRAS status. They used to accept affirmations that were conducted by people, by companies, and then provided a response to the public stating that this ingredient was affirmed by FDA GRAS. FDA no longer does that. And FDA rarely conducts a determination or a conclusion of GRAS themselves. Most times, companies have to present or notify. The notification process, starting in 1997, was subsumed and took into the whole GRAS process of FDA affirming GRAS. Now a company submits under the notification process their GRAS. So between GRAS and self-affirmation GRAS or self-affirmed GRAS, there's no distinction.
Okay.
It's a company's determination of GRAS.
Okay. All right. So the next one is, with advances in food technology and food processing, I'm sure that many people have this next question. What types of compounds can be considered for a GRAS designation? Both natural and synthetic, modified natural? Are there any limitations or restrictions on this if it can be both demonstrated and considered safe?
That's a very good question, because a lot of people are concerned that GRAS substances only can be natural, or GRAS substances can only be partially modified. In all senses of the word, a GRAS substance can be any of those things. They can be a synthetic substance. They can be a totally natural extract or a natural substance in and of themselves, or they can be combinations, semi-synthetic, or an extract, an ethanolic extract, or something like that. They can definitely, as long as you have the data, first and foremost, what you really need to do is understand the composition of an ingredient. You have to have specifications defining what your ingredient is, and that you can consistently manufacture it. Those are the three major things that a lot of companies, I wouldn't say fall down on, but they have a difficulty starting out with, because that really sets the stage for how you move forward in determining safety, in moving forward in evaluating what other information is out there in the literature in order to show or substantiate safety of the ingredient. But any number of those types of ingredients can be considered GRAS.
I believe, to build on that, a good follow-up question would be, I mean, does this impact bioengineered products as well?
This does.
Or does it apply to it?
It does apply to bioengineered ingredients or products of bioengineered plants or bacteria, algae. All of those are fine for use as GRAS or for conclusions as GRAS ingredients. Now, the more you bioengineer something, the more you change it, that may impact the amount of safety data that's necessary to show safety. Okay. So for something that is pretty well known, pretty well seen in the diet, it's only been concentrated and essentially cleaned up from something that's found in food already, that may need less scientific substantiation of safety than something that is totally synthetic and the human body has never seen before. So that's difference in terms of the scientific depth that is needed.
But GRAS can apply.
But GRAS can
to all
apply.
the above.
Yes. Now, FDA may request, after you notify it, that because of certain concerns on health or relationships to certain ingredients, that they may want to see the actual data involved, the raw data, things like that, and may request this be converted into a food additive petition. That's highly dependent on whether the ingredient and the constituents of the ingredient.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so building on that next question or previous question. The next question explores the applicability of GRAS for ingredients and potential credibility of the ingredient or the GRAS process outside the US. What is the scope of FDA GRAS? It specifically excludes supplements and some end uses such as gummies, but it is used as a proxy of trust. How much does FDA GRAS approval influence the global market acceptance, for example, EFSA, and more critically, the industrial consumers?
Okay, there's a lot of different moving parts.
Yeah,
so
there's really two questions there.
Let me break that down a little bit. The scope of GRAS in the United States and how it impacts other countries is essentially the brunt of that question. Obviously, FDA here in the United States and the GRAS process is very centric to the US and the US regulatory process. Now, the impact that would have in terms of a GRAS that was evaluated by the client or by the industry and internally concluded as GRAS, that holds some weight as long as you have the appropriate substantiation of safety. You've crossed the T's, dotted the I's, and everything really substantiates safety. You know, the general conclusion, generally recognized as safe conclusion. If you notify that GRAS conclusion and receive a no objection letter from FDA, that may hold weight for some other regulatory bodies in other countries. Some. They look favorably on it because they know that another regulatory body has looked at this data and has agreed. Now, some countries may not agree with that assessment because they have their own internal concerns on how they evaluate safety. So it is not a slam dunk to say that if you get a no objection letter from FDA on your GRAS, it's going to be smooth sailing for other countries. It's definitely not the case, but it does build on the understanding that a internationally recognized regulatory body does not see safety concerns of this ingredient when used as intended.
It adds to the credibility, but it's not a slam dunk for sure.
No, it is not.
Okay. I mean, before we move on to the next question, I do want to go back to the first part of this question. I think that the asker here was wanting to ask about what can GRAS apply to, and the person also asks specifically, I mean, the person basically alludes to the fact that they don't believe that GRAS applies to dietary supplements. Do you mind commenting on GRAS and dietary supplements before we move on?
Sure. It is true that GRAS substances are not considered, how should I put this? GRAS substances do apply in certain ways to dietary supplements because GRAS substances can be considered under new dietary ingredient notification guidance. GRAS substances can be considered new dietary ingredients, and they can be added to dietary supplements as long as that dietary or that GRAS substance has been in the food supply for a certain amount of time and is added to the dietary supplement at a specific level that was concluded as at GRAS or below that level. So there's several caveats to that. You know, not only that, from looking at the FDA's NDIN GRAS draft guidance, which is non-binding, but FDA still looks at it and evaluates things. The cumulative exposure between both the GRAS substance intake that is expected to be consumed, plus the expected consumption from the dietary supplement use, cannot exceed the acceptable daily intake limit that the GRAS had concluded. So there's a lot of moving parts there,
There's a lot of gray.
but a substance that was concluded as GRAS can be added to dietary supplements under certain conditions.
Okay, good. I think that should answer your question. All right, this next attendee wants to understand when a GRAS is necessary. Then here's the question. How do you know when a GRAS certification is required for a plant extract used as a food ingredient to inhibit mold and yeast?
Okay, now this has some questions right back to this person. If this extract has previously been concluded as safe or is in common use. So there's a lot of ingredients out there, a lot of extracts or a lot of things that have common use, and you'll never find a GRAS status to them.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, this is the most I've spoken in weeks with this matter.
Definitely a fun challenge.
Yes. So in that case, if there's just common knowledge that this extract has been safe at typical use levels, then you would not have to do a new GRAS.
Okay.
But you would have to make sure and understand if this is a new use. So, for example, I get this quite a bit. If you are utilizing, for example, rosemary oil. Rosemary oil is an extract from rosemary and is used as a flavoring. However, at high levels, high concentrations, it can also, they found that it is also a preservative. So you've done two things here in changing the general knowledge that the rosemary oil is safe. One is you're likely adding it to different foodstuffs and foods to promote preservation. And number two, you're likely adding it at higher concentrations. So now do you have data to substantiate that that higher concentration would also be considered safe?
Okay.
So at that point, I would probably look very close to see if there's safety data out there for that flavoring or that oil extract to be considered safe under the intended conditions of use.
Okay. Before we move on, I do have another question to build on that.
Sure.
You know, when you said common use, you know, I think of a good example to start would be an apple. You wouldn't find a GRAS for an apple.
Correct.
But when you start cutting things down, adding solvents to extract certain things, at what point would you consider that a portion of an apple or an apple ingredient needing a GRAS? What point would you say, you know, an extract of an apple would be considered necessary for GRAS?
Well, this is
Find the gross
we get this a lot.
oversimplification.
No, but we get
I'm
this
just trying
a
to
lot.
follow that line.
And it's
that's
one
what
of
this person
those,
wants.
many times if it is a water extract of something, you typically wouldn't have to include GRAS status.
Okay.
Something very simple or a mechanical dehydration, and then you turn it into a powder.
Not really changing the chemical.
Not really changing the chemistry.
Okay.
But if you start using something other than water, other than basic ethanol, even then you might want to look at that. If you're pulling out polyphenols or other things, other chemicals, and concentrating them to a higher level than what would be in an apple as you consume it.
Okay.
That's when you start to getting into that line or crossing that line, and you start saying, well, would all of these polyphenols at the concentrations that we're getting and applying to the different foods be safe? Would we have safety concerns with any of these that we see? And this is again where your specifications really come into play. You have to understand what's in your product in order to understand whether there is a safety concern there. So
the composition is drastically different than the commonly accepted apple form.
The composition is different, as well as there's always a statement within not only the FDA but the Food and Drug Law Act. You may have rendered your food toxic or having problems to it because you've concentrated something that, when consumed at such low levels, is not a concern. But when you've concentrated it down, you may have concentrated a toxin that is now adverse to the health. Taking your apple idea further. As a contaminant, when you're producing applesauce, some apple seeds get into the whole mix and they're ground up when they're producing applesauce. I'm assuming. So when you're consuming that, the apple seeds within applesauce would not be considered a toxin or adverse because the level is so low of those seeds, because those seeds do contain some toxins in them that at high levels would be detrimental to health. But if you take the rinds of the apples themselves and then do extractions, you may have just extracted out that toxin and produced something that would be detrimental.
So characterization, understanding the composition,
Understanding the composition
will dictate whether or not you think you need one.
Exactly.
Need a GRAS.
And so that's why I said at the beginning, your specifications in understanding that you can reliably and consistently produce your product and understanding its composition are key in moving forward, not only with a GRAS, but even determining if you do need a GRAS.
Okay, you heard it here first. Step one, characterization. All right, I think that does it. I think that does a good response to that one. All right, this next question pertains to the proper identification of an ingredient, so it's kind of building on that. How does a species of algae have to be identified in a GRAS process? Is it by DNA? What taxonomic library or website is best? And how are changes in taxonomy addressed?
Okay. What FDA typically states for any botanical is that you have to understand, and I'm lumping algae as botanical into this generalization. You need the genus and species, and many times down to the strain level. So you really have to characterize what your microalgae is. So in that way, you may want to do homology sequences with libraries within. You can do it within ATCC. You can do it with. There are many different libraries out there. UTEX is another one. You look at the homology of that, be it bacteria, be it plant, be it microalgae, and compare that to what's already out there. Typically on a DNA basis with FASTA, or you could do a blast sequence as well to look at those aspects. You may want to also start going down through allergenicity assessments as well. But taxonomically, you do want to look at FASTA is something that FDA has recognized and utilized in the past and agreed on in different notified GRASs. So,
okay, thank you for that. All right, this next question, it's still going right along the theme of toxicology and GRAS, but it goes into the narrative of safety. When one is producing a product by process, excuse me, I'm reading the question. For example, a protein conjugate naturally encapsulated in a yeast, what are the criteria evaluated to demonstrate safety? Inputs, processing conditions, and stoichiometry, theorized final output, that is for consumption. So I guess in essence, they're trying to figure out what do they need to demonstrate safety.
There's a lot of that goes back into what is your ingredient composed of, and is it going to be consumed? Are those protein conjugates? Have they been seen before by the human body? Have they been seen in food? Are they just minor conjugates that you're bringing up and encapsulating to provide additional dietary intake of these conjugates? Or are they something novel and something that the body really doesn't have much of a knowledge, or the published data doesn't evaluate the safety of these protein conjugates as much? The encapsulation part is going to be a question of whether that encapsulation allows it to bypass the stomach to get into the small intestine, so it's uptake is much greater into through the intestinal wall? If so, is it going to be taken up in a different manner with the conjugate part of it not metabolized as quickly by some of the enzymes within the gut? There's a lot of those questions that you have to go through and evaluate to see whether this is something novel. This is something that is not typically looked at by the body to determine if you need to go to the next step. You need to do GRAS, what types of studies you need. You need to address these questions.
Okay. All right, it depends. Classic consultant
It
answer.
does, right.
Well, I guess it really does, but once again, it's not a one size fits all. It really is context dependent, especially on the characterization and what it is.
Exactly. I could be very one size fits all and say, well, you need to do studies. You need to do all these animal studies.
But
you really don't have to. If you really look at the data and try and figure out the composition of your ingredient, how it relates to other ingredients out there already on the market, other scientific studies, you may be able to substantiate your safety without doing all of these animal studies and costing hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Okay. Okay, so this one is talking about some of the dietary exposure assessments. Has anything changed with respect to the default assumptions used for dietary exposure assessments? Is there a stronger reliance on publicly available food exposure studies?
This has cycled throughout the few decades that I've been working within this arena. And but overall, the overarching discussion, and especially when I've spoken with FDA, is they don't want a back of the napkin type of assessment. They really need something to substantiate that the exposure is based off of publicly available data. FDA in the past few years has really pushed forward the idea of utilizing US-based consumption analysis data, such as what the CDC and the USDA release on the acronym NHANES, What We Eat in America survey system. They really want the notifications or the GRAS conclusions to utilize that type of data, which is very strong in determining what foods are being consumed and at the levels of consumption.
A more accurate way or precise way to deal with what's actually consumed, the actual exposure.
Yes, exactly. Well, estimated exposure.
Yeah.
This is still an estimate. It's based on a lot of estimates from US government, but FDA has faith in those estimates.
Okay. All right, switching gears a little bit. We're running a little short on time. We have time for a couple more questions. This question concerns whether a substance generally recognized as safe for use in conventional food by FEMA, Flavor and Extract Manufacturer Association GRAS panel, could also be used as a flavor in the dietary supplement industry.
Okay, and this comes back to the other question concerning which you had asked about GRAS substances being utilized in dietary supplements. So if that substance, that flavor,
that question specifically, pardon me, was in regard to FEMA.
Correct.
Okay, pardon me.
So if that flavor that was grasped by FEMA, it has been in the food supply for a certain amount of time, and it's documented. You can find it. You can notice that it has been in the food supply, either by reviewing products or things like that over time. Then yes, it can be added to dietary supplement.
Okay. So that rule still applies regardless of FEMA.
Regardless of whether it is a FEMA GRAS or a industry GRAS.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so we had a couple more questions come in, and we'll start with this one. With the emerging field of cell-grown meat, some components of the cell culture media will likely remain as residual in the finished cultured meat. Is GRAS cell cultured media required for this process?
It depends on, well, No, you really do have to show that all the constituents within that product are safe for the intended use.
Even the cell culture media.
Even the cell culture media components, you've got to show that they're safe.
Okay.
You may be able to do that by showing that they are either have prior sanction and other uses, and explain their ability to be shown to be safe when consumed. They don't all have to be GRAS, but it is.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, they don't all have to be GRAS. Some of them are food additives. Some of them are been utilized in other sources that are consumed. So it's really dependent on breaking each one of those ingredients out and evaluating, see if there's sufficient safety.
If they've been shown to be safe.
Yes.
Okay, good to know. Another question that recently came in is, do ingredients like sugars, carbohydrates, amino acids, enzymes require GRAS approval for use as a food ingredient?
Again, that is dependent on whether you've concentrated them down from how they're typically consumed. So if a sugar is found in an apple, as we discussed before, but it's only 1/10,000th of what is found in the apple, and you have now concentrated it and isolated it to the point where it would be in food at 1/10 of the amount in food. We don't know how our body's going to react to all that type of a specific carbohydrate. So you may have to evaluate its safety, because there could be some concerns that the body would reject it.
Concentration dependent.
It is very much concentration dependent.
Now, I get to building on that question. Sorry, I have a lot of questions personally. Is there a way for you to understand where a line is commonly used, when it exceeds commonly used levels? Where does someone find something like that?
Again, many times you may have to do your own analytical research on that.
Okay.
You know, or the public literature in terms of seeing what the composition is in an acai fruit or something like that. Has there been a breakdown of the consumption?
Okay.
When you're pulling out a certain component, like a carbohydrate or a sugar, from the acai fruit or another, you know, consumed, something that's commonly consumed, where is that coming from and how concentrated are you getting it? You may end up turning over a certain line to which you have to determine that this level is not consistent with what's commonly consumed within that fruit.
So it's context dependent, and you need to do your own research.
You need to do your own research. Okay. Opinion letters can work that way in terms of companies having something in their files saying, we've already evaluated this. We don't feel that it meets the degree of rigor necessary for a GRAS conclusion, because it is being consumed at the same level that you would have found from all these other components or ingredients.
Okay. Well, I believe we're on to our last question, and this is going to be, what is the essential difference between the NDI process versus the GRAS process?
NDI process, if you would look at the FDA comments concerning that, anytime an ingredient was not a substance utilized in dietary supplements prior to October 1994, then it would be considered a new dietary ingredient. There, at that point, you should, if under certain circumstances, most circumstances, you should notify that new dietary ingredient. The differences between that is a GRAS or conclusion of GRAS has to have all the information relevant to the safety of this ingredient. Good, bad, and ugly is what we like to say. You have to explain why, not only why certain information is supportive of your GRAS conclusion, but also why information that may seem to be opposite of supporting or not supporting, why it's not relevant for that. For a dietary ingredient notification, you only have to give information that you have supporting the safety of the ingredient. Now, you should also point out whether there is concerns, but that is, the other thing is that the information that supports an NDIN notification does not have to be publicly available. You can put it in a master file with FDA, and it doesn't have to be within the public domain.
Okay. And I do believe one more thing to that is NDINs must be notified to FDA, correct?
NDIs, yes.
Versus GRAS, it's
Yes.
optional.
Under most circumstances.
Under most circumstances.
Now, going back to a GRAS ingredient that's been in the food supply, you do not necessarily have to notify that GRAS ingredient, even though technically it is a new dietary ingredient. So there's a lot of wordplay in there and caveats to that. But overall, if it's a new dietary ingredient that hasn't been GRAS and in the food supply, then most likely, yes, you should notify them.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you, Dr. Matulka, for your time and your brilliance. We want to thank all the attendees for submitting your questions. We hope you found today's Q&A very helpful. As a reminder, if we didn't get to your questions and we didn't get to everybody, please remember that we will reach out to you at a later time after the event to answer your question. And should you come up with a question a few weeks from now, if you need some guidance somewhere, feel free to reach out to us at info@burdockgroup.com and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. With that, I hope you all have a fantastic week. Definitely reach out to us if we can help. Take care.
Thank you.